There is much to appreciate about the region we call the Pacific Northwest, the stretch of coast country from northern California that reaches its fingers all the way up towards southern Alaska. The way the cedars root deep, stand tall and steady, the way the roads weave between them through forests and over mountains with the grace of a needle and thread on fabric. Follow them and you'll pass by wooden buildings that look both decades old and like they were just finished yesterday. Humanity is merely a guest here. Small white and yellow flowers stare up at you to say hello. Soft clouds and fog insulate you from everywhere else, a blanket over your shoulders or a hand tracing down your back. You are dwarfed by something unnameable here, something much greater, whose roots you sense underneath you as you walk, and they sense you in return. Humanity and the wild are so close, shoulder to shoulder, face to face, closer than a kiss. The Pacific Northwest is the last remaining part of the true American West. And when thinking like that, there's little surprise as to the downpour of love artists and writers share alike for the region. There's Twin Peaks, Gravity Falls, Life is Strange, Twilight, Alan Wake, Bates Motel, What Remains of Edith Finch, even the Oregon Trail video game from the 70s. There's a slow-forming echo chamber of enchantment for the Alaska to California stretch and everything in between it. But why? It's beautiful, it's serene. There's an abundance of places like that, though, isn't there? Why does everything take place here? What lies under that beauty? What are these stories trying to tell us? Well, the entirety of the Pacific Northwest goes from southern Alaska through the western coast of Canada, Washington, Oregon, and then downwards to Idaho and northern California. Many of these stories focus on just two states, Washington and Oregon. Washington and Oregon culture, both lumped together and respectively, make for a perfect story setting. The cultures deeply imbued with counterculturalism, a longing to abandon the suffocating normative, to replace it with a total burial into the outdoors. And drugs. The east sides of both states are viewed as fairly liberal, green paradises, endless expanses of forests and mountain only stopped by the west coast, and interrupted with the occasional rural town that runs across it. The stories that take place here match that intrigue. Wikipedia goes through the painstaking effort of listing every single piece of media set in both Oregon and Washington, and of course Northern Cali, Canada, Alaska, Idaho, and so on. But for the sake of simplicity, we'll focus on the most well-known here. You don't even need me to mention most of them. Gravity Falls, Life is Strange, Twin Peaks. Those three are likely why you clicked on this video, are they not? There's also Twilight, to be fair, and then smaller indie video games like Alan Wake's and What Remains of Edith Finch, and so on. The Bates Motel show, the Oregon Trail, even technically 50 Shades of Grey. Feel free to remind me what I forgot in the comments. My list of recommendations since starting this channel is a good mile long, so why not a couple more at this point? But most, if not all of these stories, are built atop of the same core themes as well. They're stories of mystery, of the unexplainable, the supernatural. They're stories of nature's dark side and humanity's own, with topics of mental illness and drugs and psychological horror providing the depth of that underbelly. The main characters are most often social outcasts, people who don't quite fit in normal groups for one reason or another. So, instead, they find themselves in the alcove of the wilderness, or as close to them as they can get. Of course, both these characters and their stories in the broader sense fit the Pacific Northwest like a glove. They line up near perfectly with the region's unshakable sense of individualism, one that borders on isolation. In fact, the rainy mountain ranges and the forests grant a perfect enclosure for these themes. The Pacific Northwest is the modern-day frontier, something we'll go into depth about later. That frontierism, or should I say anti-frontierism, is also a vital part of what makes the Pacific Northwest feel so magical. In a country with such widespread decimation from industry and urbanization, the rural parts of the Pacific Northwest can become a refuge. Industrialization hasn't tainted all of its land, and hopefully it never will. So, here, the supernatural and the unexplainable still thrive from isolation, similar to Gothic literature and fiction. In traditional Gothic lit, they were most often set in castles and sprawling estates. Europe has been a pretty, condensed continent for centuries, including back then, so these expansive chunks of land only owned by individuals or families were the perfect way to let isolation, nature, and the supernatural coalesce. Now it works the same, just with castles, moors, and estates being replaced with small towns, lighthouses, and in-the-middle-of-nowhere diners. All in all, the Pacific Northwest seems like the perfect breeding ground for lingering mysteries, stories that can ponder on themselves for years, if not decades. There's a certain uniqueness to all of them, but it's not something that's named too often. So what exactly is it? I could have sworn that, before making this video, this was an already established thing. Apparently, though, it's not. There's a literary magazine that focuses on Pacific Northwest Gothic and some Tumblr bands, but that's about it. Instead of skimming through a Wikipedia page and a couple articles, we have to do this by ourselves, like big kids. To answer the question, what is Pacific Northwest Gothic, we can look to its more respected elder cousin, Southern Gothic. The subgenre combined Gothic storytelling mechanics with the values and the setting of the American South, the humidity, the Spanish moss, the lazy drawl, the decomposing sense of Confederate pride, etc., etc. Pacific Northwest Gothic does much of the same. It's almost like the hippie lumberjack cousin. It takes the values and the key characteristics of the Pacific Northwest and subverts them, showing the audience in detail how all of those things can go wrong in the horror, scary, story sense. Meanwhile, you are slowly led to take in just how beautiful it can all be, the good and the bad, in the meantime. Southern Gothic was especially inspired by the shift in culture before, during, and after the Civil War, an event that some of the South has yet to really move on from. The stories within the genre are built on top of the foundations of American societal critique, especially the cultural happenings of the South. It especially highlights the darker side that most media and art had yet to pay attention to at that point. After all, the South does deserve critique. The Pacific Northwest Gothic style seems to take inspiration from this, even if that's a subconscious choice. As magical as all of these rural Oregon/Washington areas are, not all of it is perfect. These stories feel around for those dark slivers and shine the spotlight on the Pacific Northwest in its entirety. Another inspiration for the subgenre is frontierism, as we already said. Frontierism is a term I keep on saying, but I've yet to properly define, so here you go. American frontierism, also known as frontier thesis, was the idea that founded much of early American ideals. It praised rugged individualism, a departure from the feudalist societies that still grasped Europe, albeit with a weakening grip. And instead of kingdoms built from peasants, nobilities, and the clergy all fighting each other for territory and thrones, Americans sought out a new ideal. The lone pioneer beating a greater enemy, being the Wild West. No more nobility, no more aristocrats or hierarchies, just people, aka white guys, carving out their own frontier in the so-called American Wild. There's a lot of hypocrisy to be pointed out here, considering there were already people here, living here, that were not wild, but that is a topic for another time, because YouTube's already not very nice to me. But anyways, while the Pacific Northwest and its Gothic subgenre aren't exactly peak pioneers in the current day, the main values still stand. Social egalitarianism, rejection of the bourgeoisie, and above all, the constant human potential for violence. After all, there's no rules, right? Isolation can do many things to a man. The Gothic movement made that fact very clear. Pacific Northwest Gothic does too, since it does fall under the broader umbrella. The main characteristics that lend itself over to this little, decisively American piece of it, though, are the heavy links between the environment and the story happening within it. After all, would Life is Strange or Twin Peaks or even Twilight be able to happen anywhere else? On top of that, Pacific Northwest Gothic also dabbles in religious and spiritual themes, especially Twin Peaks, thanks to David Lynch's own interest in spirituality that I don't fully understand, as well as how they blend in with supernatural events. Many of the pieces in this little subgenre also fall into the magical realism style, where unexplainable things just tend to happen. Sometimes they explain it, or at least attempt to, but for most of these stories, they're just there, and they're disturbing. You can't have the Gothic without the grotesque. The Pacific Northwest version just happens to focus on isolation and what total freedom of the self can do to someone. Max Caulfield loses touch with reality as she grapples with the true power of her time travel, for example. Alan Wake goes crazy in the woods fighting shadow beings. Bob possesses anybody that lets him in and drives them to their absolute worst. Gravity Falls is pretty much the accumulation of every supernatural thing under the sun, and that's even without touching on Phil Cipher. It's all very grotesque, very emotional, and very, very extreme. However, the next little piece of influence for the Pacific Northwest Gothic subgenre, say that 5 times fast, is a little harder to fully pin down. But the best way for me to explain it is this. The isolation and departure from society in this genre reminds me a lot of No Exit by Jean-Paul Sartre and existentialist philosophy as a whole. Basically, in No Exit, a bunch of people are trapped in a hotel room as their own personal hell. They get the option to leave, near the end, I think, and they decide to stay because they depend on each other's perception to validate themselves. So, in the grand scheme of things, it's not really the other people that are torturing them within this hotel, but it's their continuing decisions that bring on their misery. So, because of our freedom to make choices like these at any time, and our limits in having to deal with the consequences of such choices, we cannot really nail down our single purpose in life. We're not a coffee pot, or a calculator, or even like a cow or something. We can do whatever we want. Freedom is integral to both the Pacific Northwest Gothic and the region as a whole. Why else would someone live in the middle of nowhere if not to escape from or avoid the limits of urban life? In Pacific Northwest Gothic, this most often shows up in the fact that the bad people and the villains in these stories end up doing bad things simply because they choose to. Mark Jefferson and Frank Bowers don't give tragic backstories for supplying insert drug here that I can't name to high schoolers. Nobody forced them to do that. Bob is a representation of the evil that men choose to do. There is no curse ravaging the Finch family. They just make really poor parenting choices over and over again because they never learn from their mistakes. There's no overarching explanation to anyone's actions past the fact that they choose to do them. And then, of course, the other key influence of Pacific Northwest Gothic has very little to do with people at all. Instead, it's about the region's steadfast environmentalism. After all, that's the reason why urban sprawl is controlled in Oregon and Washington in the first place. It's on purpose. Within Pacific Northwest Gothic, we call this, and the literature and philosophy and the political sphere in general, we call this ecocentrism, which I have talked about to death on this channel, but I don't care. Ecocentrism is the practice of taking the focus away from humanity when considering the world and the environment and stepping back to appreciate nature in its entirety and all of the parts that create it, sentient or non-sentient, living or otherwise. It even means appreciating the rock next to your backyard tree. It's all important. Humanity is a very, very tiny part in this world when you really think about it. And while this is technically a huge contradiction to frontierism, which I said was one of the main influences, Pacific Northwest Gothic manages, in a way, oftentimes in these stories, there's a specific highlight put on human insignificance and the beauty of nature separate from humanity. Life is Strange specifically rewards you for your photography and appreciating nature, giving you little Easter eggs whenever you wander around to take photos. The Twin Peaks intro scene shows birds and beautiful Washington landscapes before most any person. People love this subgenre so ardently because of the tranquil sense this aspect gives them, even with the borderline scary themes that many of these stories have. This is what makes the stories magical. Well, kind of. I'd be a complete hypocrite to go through this entire video without calling out the genre's tendency to take indigenous influence and turn it into what can only be described as woo-woo magic stuff. Not that indigenous spirituality or beliefs are woo-woo magic stuff, but nobody really pays attention to that when they're writing these sorts of stories. Life is Strange particularly has a bad habit of this, but the common trend across all of Pacific Northwest Gothic is to commodify and stereotype natives rather than giving them depth and respect that they deserve. I can't even link the inspiration to any specific peoples or ideologies because there's no human way that the writers did any of that when they were creating these stories. It'd be borderline disrespectful to do so myself. But apart from the racist tendencies and everything else that the Pacific Northwest Gothic draws from, let's stop talking about it as an extension to other ideas. What are the main aspects of Pacific Northwest Gothic in its own right? Pacific Northwest Gothic can be described as all of the things we've already listed. Supernatural events that are tied to both nature and the individual, and that drive the individual away from humanity or society on some level. The Finch house is so isolated from everyone else because of the curse. Anyone who enters the Black Lodge never comes back the same, if at all. Max Caulfield's sacrifices Arcadia Bay, Bella's whole enchantment with the Cullens. Of course, this goes in hand with the appreciation for nature. Whether it's passive or an active part of the plot, you literally can't escape the beautiful scenery in media like this. They strictly avoid entering too many urban areas in the Pacific Northwest, usually only small towns and the areas bordering on the outskirts, or even being completely swallowed up by nature itself. All of this isolation goes to shine a perfect spotlight on the dangers of human evil, too. It's a key theme across all of the narratives here, whether you look at Bob and the Black Lodge, or Mark Jefferson and Nathan Prescott, or whatever the hell is going on in Alan Wake's mind, because I tried my best to play that game. I really did try, but the writing made no sense to me. Pacific Northwest Gothic goes to form a cautionary tale of how freedom and separatism from broader humanity amplifies humans' own danger and darkness. And then, finally, all of these shows have an inherent and inseparable sense of mystery to them. They leave you unable to fully grasp the reality within it. Many of the mysteries in this subgenre are left open-ended, as if inviting the audience to continue exploring it on their own. A narrative frontier, if you will. I mean, imagine how dull Twin Peaks or Edith Finch would be if they just told you the events without any sort of secrecy or intrigue. The Pacific Northwest presents you with a choice. You can surround yourself with others in a small town or even a city and make other people happy, put up a facade of being put together until you end up with dysentery or wrapped in plastic. Or you can withdraw completely. Stop hiding those murky parts of yourself under the folds and retreat. Maybe you'll find something spectacular under that surface, what you were searching for all along. Or maybe you'll just lose yourself, too. Pacific Northwest asks you one question. Are you willing to take that gamble?